century opportunity to really rethink and revise some ways that we do the work around education, our students, but also the teachers who do that work. So if I can share my screen, am I able to jump in here? Okay, I am. Thank you, Lisa. So I want to talk anti-racism here in teacher education. And I would encourage folks throughout my time here, because I'm not sure how much time we'll have for Q&A on the back end, but to put comments in the chat and put, concerns about what I share in the chat or questions in the chat, and I'll try to incorporate them because I really want to get your input. I realize I'm here with a group of experts. You all do this work like I do, and we know it's not easy. We know it's ever changing. So I, in many ways, see myself as talking to the choir or preaching to the choir, if you will, because I would imagine that many of you, hopefully all of you, understand the need for us to be more focused on anti-racism in teacher education. And part of the challenge is how do we get this to be much more sort of endemic to the work we do across the board. So I want to start off by, again, just offering each and every one of you a big thank you for what you do. I think our work has been challenging and trying enough as it is before we had this pandemic. And I think post and during this pandemic, it's become even more trying and challenging, trying to support our candidates virtually, trying to help them to understand what this is going to look like when we don't know what it's going to look like, because schools don't know what it's going to look like, because the state doesn't know what it's going to look like. So we're all in some cases in a situation where we almost feel like the blind leading the blind. And you've had to try to find the ways to best keep this together and keep your candidates and keep your novice folks, to keep them sort of together and thinking about how this new normal has to unfold. So I just want to say thank you all for doing this work. It's not easy, like I said earlier. It's always sort of unfolding, but I want to thank you for doing this work. So I think about this moment, and I really want to think about Baldwin for a second, because as many of you know, Baldwin has this, I think, this really great piece that he comes out with in 1963 called "A Talk to Teachers." And I think in so many ways, Baldwin's Talk to Teachers is really relevant now, 50 plus years after the fact, because what Baldwin says in his letter to teachers in 1963 is, like, he says, let's begin by saying that we are living through a very dangerous time. He goes on to talk about the fact that we're in a revolutionary situation. No matter how unpopular that word is, we have to face our current set of realities. And I think in this moment, these words are apropos, because in many ways we are living through very dangerous times. Anytime you have over 140,000 people who have lost their lives in a very short period of time, if that's not dangerous, I don't know what it is. Anytime you've seen the kind of racial unrest and the response to that racial unrest that we've seen in the last several months, I don't know if that is not considered a dangerous time. So in many ways, what I want to talk about today is the way I think we have to frame our efforts to support teachers and to support teacher educators ourselves, and to support folks who are in teacher education themselves, our students, through these dangerous times. And I do that through this way of thinking about this around what I've been referring to as our double tsunami. And I talk about this tsunami as a framework because I think anytime you talk about a tsunami, as you all know, it talks about a complete disruption, a complete devastation, a complete transformation of a normal order. And it really forces folks to have to rebuild and reassemble and sort of reimagine the manner upon which life as they knew it is going to be reconsidered. And I think in many ways we are dealing with a double tsunami in terms of what that's going to look like. And I think if we're not being very explicit and persistent with our students about this double tsunami, I think we're going to be setting them up for failure in the field. And so to that end, let me walk through these double tsunamis, as you probably know what they are, and talk about some of the implications as it pertains to this larger issue around sort of anti-racism. So obviously the first tsunami, as you can imagine, is coronavirus that we have been dealing with for the past 4 months. And we have obviously never seen anything like this in our lifetimes. There have been several generations that have not witnessed anything to this effect. And I want us to make sure that everything that we're doing is talking about sort of the manner upon which COVID-19 is fundamentally and profoundly shaped the way we all live our lives. The fact that we're having this meeting right now virtually is a byproduct of COVID-19. The degree to which we have not been at many of our places of work for who knows how long is a result of COVID-19. The degrees to which our young people have not been at their school sites for a number of months is a byproduct of COVID-19. So obviously, without going into a whole lot of detail, we know this has transformed the ways in which we live, the ways we learn, the ways we link with friends and family. But part of what I think we need to be mindful of as we think about this is that there are some racial realities of COVID-19 that need to be talked about. And they're happening in some circles, but I think they need to continually happen in the work that we do, because in many ways we know that these issues tied to COVID are not affecting all populations in the same way. They're not affecting all communities in the same manner. And as you can imagine, folks of color are feeling a sort of a more intense brunt of this than their white peers are. And so I think we have to start asking some questions about how we think about this work that we do when we know that many of the schools that we work with and support are comprised majority of students of color. And we must begin to understand that we see all kinds of data that tells us the disproportionality upon which Black and Brown communities are being affected by not only contracting the virus, but also dying from the virus. So to that end, we also have to be mindful of the ripple effect that has. There was a report that just came out last week here in the state of California that looked at the degrees to which Asian Pacific Islanders are being disproportionately, again, affected and dying from COVID-19. And so part of what the reality is for many communities of color in the state of California is this dilemma about whether or not to reopen schools. And I think many families of color, many children of color are facing a dilemma that may be very unique in that it's almost a lose-lose situation. And there's a report that came out today that really highlighted this lose-lose situation, that for families of color, keeping children at home, which obviously has safety ramifications, means that students are going to lose out on precious time in the classroom, which is critical for their development. The students who have special needs, students who have certain types of supports that can be best provided at school, they're missing out on that. And not only that, as you all know, but for many cases, we have students who we serve, I'm talking K-12 students now, whose parents and caregivers are essential workers, meaning that they are in situations where they cannot work virtually, they cannot be at home with their children, so they're having to scramble to find childcare, daycare, having to figure out how their children can be connected virtually. So it's a lose from the standpoint of children staying home, but there's also a lose if children go back to schools that are not safe. And so this is the real hard choice, and we see this with lots of the students that we are trying to support by way of you know what this means. As the state was trying to figure out, do we open schools, do we not open schools? Because we know young people who are experiencing homelessness, young people who are in foster care, young people who are facing deep poverty, experience this in a very different way. And we know that disproportionately that those populations tend to be students of color. So I think as we talk about COVID with our students at the university level, I think we need to be careful about sort of painting this in a one size fits all approach, but to really begin to sort of unpack some of the different sets of challenges and obstacles that we know lots of our students of color and families of color are facing. So to that end, I think one of the things we have to do, coronavirus is having on our young people. So as we think about preparing teachers who are going to interact with young people in K-12 schools, we need to have them understand and be fully mindful of, sensitive to, and really thoughtful around the degrees to which we have young people, K-12 students now, who have witnessed some things that no children should ever have to experience. We know that there are children out there who have lost parents. We know that there are children out there who have lost siblings. We know that there are children out there who have lost grandparents, and we know children out there who have lost friends. Part of what we have to recognize that in this COVID moment, that death and loss of a loved one is hard enough by itself, but it's made even harder by the degrees to which we know many people have lost their loved ones in a very detached manner, meaning that they're not there to see them take their last breath. They have not been able to visit them in the hospital. We know that the way that this virus has impacted individuals is that once individuals are in hospitals, oftentimes we see people who are dying alone, without friends, without families. So that makes the grieving process even more challenging for lots of our students. So I maintain that as we come back to schools virtually and or in person, whenever that is, that we're going to see lots of our students who are suffering some of the real devastating effects of mental health, social emotional challenges, loss, and things of that nature. So we need to help our teacher candidates understand the ways in which our students are manifesting that hurt, and the way that they're manifesting that frustration, and the way they're manifesting that pain. Because if we don't, part of what we know is that if teachers walk into these classrooms, even virtually, and don't understand the full sort of depths and breadth of mental health challenges that students are facing, we see students who are oftentimes penalized, punished, and excluded for reasons that they should not be penalized, punished, and excluded. Because what students are basically trying to convey to us in their own unique ways is that they're hurting, that they're in need of help, support, and assistance. So I need us to make sure that as we do this work, that we're being mindful of adverse childhood experiences, many of which we know were already highly present in many communities of color. But if you look at these issues here, we know that COVID has only intensified the degrees to which these issues are being played out in many of our schools, many of our homes and communities. These are not very easy topics to talk about, but I think if we're going to do this work around educational justice and anti-racism, we must begin to have hard conversations about the ways in which mental health, for example, is oftentimes viewed as a taboo topic in many communities of color. How issues around mental well-being are oftentimes avoided in many communities of color. And I think that we have to begin to help our teacher candidates begin to understand the ways in which they can be sort of the conduits between many of their students, their families, their communities, and the kinds of supports that we know that children are going to have. So if you look at, for example, some of these issues around physical abuse, emotional neglect, what we continue to see across the state is that we have various child protective service agencies that have said that they've seen a decrease in the number of cases that are being reported, probably about a 50% decrease we've seen statewide. However, many child welfare experts believe that the actual cases of child abuse and neglect has probably gone up significantly because we know that about 65, 70% of all children who are reported to Child Protective Services are typically reported by an educator or someone in the education realm. But because educators have not been in close proximity to students, the numbers of reports have gone down. So part of what we have to know is that these issues are still rampant in many of our communities, and we have to find ways to think about the degrees to which safety is going to help support our children. So part of what I think we have to do is, if we're going to help have our teachers support our students, is that they're going to have to be willing to talk about how they can check in with them often. We have to talk to our teacher candidates about the fact that virtually connecting can be more challenging, but it is still doable. And lots of teachers are out there doing that with one-on-ones. They're checking with students in ways that perhaps they have not in the past. They're talking to caregivers to see that the caregivers have what support they might have. And I think it's going to require being more innovative and more creative. The second bullet here, I think we have to talk to our candidates about the fact that they're going to have to be prepared to expect different types of behavior for students. I still find it deeply troubling that I have some of my teacher colleagues and friends who are sharing with me experiences of not liking to see students who don't have their cameras turned on during learning sessions. I think that's a loaded set of issues to unpack. Lots of children don't want to show in their houses, don't want to show who's in their houses. There's issues of safety that they may feel like they don't want to have questioned. There's issues of stability that they don't want to be queried about. So I just think we have to be willing to be a little bit more flexible and talk to our candidates about the ways in which different behaviors might be manifested by our students. And the bottom line is we have to continue to listen and learn from our students. So the more we stress to our students that we're trying to support them, and we want them to in turn to support their students. And then the importance of is reestablishing routines and familiarity for our students as they come back to the virtual space, so that they can understand that there's something that they're going to come into contact with more consistently. And then to be aware of family stressors. Again, we know that families of color are facing the remnants of this pandemic in a much more difficult way than many of their white peers. And so we know that issues of unemployment are higher for people of color, the rates of eviction are higher for people of color. We know the homelessness rates are higher for people of color up and down the state as a result of this pandemic. So family stressors typically create lots of challenges for young people, and we must make sure that we are talking with our teacher education students about the manners in which stability, safety, routines, and familiar circumstances and situations are going to be critical for our students. So to that end, I maintain that what we must do, and we've done this here in LA County, more than ever, I think we have to do a better job as teacher educators of helping our teacher ed students understand various resources that are available in their respective communities that they can share with families and caregivers. So here are just some of the ones that we've collected in Los Angeles County with the work I do with the Pritzker Center. We've identified supports for families, financial help, food and grocery programs, supports for those families experiencing homelessness, violence intervention programs, digital libraries. These kinds of programs, or some variation of them, exist typically in all of our counties or very close to our counties. We have to engage in much more explicit connection between the supports and resources that are out there for families who are in really difficult situations, so that they can understand how to best utilize them. Here in LA County, I'm not sure about other counties. I know we have folks who are here from up and down the state. 211 is like the go-to hotline number. We share this with families now to say if there's anything that they just have questions about, 211 is a viable and vital resource. The Department of Mental Health has got a warm line for families, for children who want to call to just talk through problems, concerns. We're getting reports from the Department of Mental Health about the rates of mental health issues being on the rise, depression, suicidal ideation. These are real factors that are happening to not just our caregivers, but also to many of our students as well. Here we also have the guide for immigrant Californians. There's been a lot of misinformation that's been out talking about the ways in which information has been shared that folks cannot come forward if they're not documented. We don't want to see that happen to families. There's enough pressure, enough stress as it is, so we want to help them separate fact from fiction. And you can see some of these other resources in terms of making sure that we see and we know that schools are hubs for many of our communities. We want our teacher education students, our pre-service candidates, to walk into schools being mindful, aware, and connected to the resources that can be a huge, huge lifesaver for many of our families. So I just want to make sure that those issues are there, and we're finding ways to equip our candidates with that. And I would also add this before I move to tsunami number 2. I think we also have to make sure we check in on the mental health and well-being of our teachers. This work was hard before COVID. It's become even more challenging before COVID. So I would ask each and every one of you, and I've thought about this as I prepare to embark on my own teaching in the fall, to just check the overall pulse of the teachers that we are supporting in our classrooms, our students. They're also juggling all the stressors of healthcare and safety and loved ones, and for some of them, their own children. And so part of what we are doing is asking them to take care of the students that they will be working with. I think it's important for us to make sure we're checking in with them, because there can be a serious and significant toll that this process can even have on the caregivers, because the emotional drain often goes unacknowledged. We don't talk about it. And this is why we see a lot of teachers who are taking stress leaves, burnout, early retirement, and the list goes on. So we have to be mindful of the ways in which we talk about self-care and supports for our candidates, as well as the folks that they work with. So I want to make sure that those issues around mental health, social emotional well-being remain at the forefront of what we do, because if not, we will find ourselves in real dire straits, because if people are not healthy, they cannot be the best educators that we want them to be. So I want to make sure that we are constantly doing that check-in. So let me move into tsunami number 2. And as you can imagine, tsunami number 2 is really around the racial unrest that we've seen in our nation, really in our world, for the past couple of months. And I think that the degrees to which we think about our work as teacher educators has to be informed by this moment and by these movements. And so I think to that end, we have got to really be serious now. And I think many of our programs have talked about issues of racial justice. We've sort of, given lip service around racial injustice, but I think now is the moment that we are finding that people are going to demand that we do a better job of making sure we address issues around racial equity. And I want to make sure that we make it very explicit and abundantly clear that while the movements around racial justice and racial unrest really were anchored in the issue of police brutality, I want us to make sure that we are engaging our students at the university level about the fact that racial injustice also happens in schools and in classrooms, that racial violence happens in schools and in classrooms, and that racial exclusion happens in schools and classrooms. I don't want us to have this conversation around what happened to George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery to only be seen as something that happens within the law enforcement domain. Because as we all know, if we spend enough time in schools, as you all do, we spend enough time in classrooms, as you all do, you would understand the degrees to which some students feel oftentimes marginalized, the degrees to which they feel invisible, the degrees to which they feel they are targets of racial microaggressions are all too real. So I think we've got to start to make sure that the work we do with pre-service teachers is sensitive to and mindful of the racial realities that take place in our school. So I think we have to sort of take a deeper dive and look at some hard questions in our respective programs. And I think one of the things we can do is by taking an anti-racist stance. And I think we have to start to engage in this work around anti-racism. I think in some of our programs, we don't even like to say the word racism. So we can start there by saying racism. Racism is real, racism happens. But part of what anti-racism is all about is not just saying that anti-racism is something that we think is important, but it's the doing part that's important. And so if you look at the work of Kendi Ibram, he's talked about the fact that saying that you are an anti-racist is very different from saying that you're not racist. For people who say that they're not racist, basically is a really passive stance to say that, I would not necessarily take a real active sort of set of steps towards racism, but I think it's a bad thing. So we're trying to move away from just the saying of certain things about racism to the actual part of doing things about racism. And so I think an anti-racism stand is an active process of beginning to identify and eliminate all of the procedures, the structures, the attitudes and practices that we know oftentimes contribute to and reinforce racism. So what might that look like for us in teacher education is the question. I think for those of us who are here, we have to take on a much more anti-racist leadership approach in teacher education, meaning that some of this work, many of us are already doing, but I would say that in some cases, we've got to sort of deepen the work because we still haven't had the kind of traction that we need to have. So I think for us in teacher education, what anti-racist leadership can look like is we are talking to our staffs, talking to our colleagues, talking to our leadership, talking with our leadership on a more consistent basis about the needs, the experiences, and the concerns of racially marginalized students in our respective teacher education programs. Because we know in many of our teacher ed programs, oftentimes certain racialized groups are not talked about, discussed as it pertains to how we support them, how we listen to their needs, or how we see the kinds of concerns that they have around the ways in which we are providing support for them or not providing support for them. I think in this work, we also have to examine data in our own programs regularly around racial equity. Who are we being able to attract to our program? Who are we not attracting to our program? Who has opportunity? Who does well in our program? Who doesn't finish our program? Who can't get through Praxis 1? Who can't get through the CSET, right? We have to start looking at our data, not again with this one size fits all approach, but also looking at it through a lens of racial equity to see who are we servicing well. I know for many of our teacher ed programs up and down the state, we hear Black students continue to say that they feel like they are oftentimes one of the most marginalized groups. We've got to look at that data. We have to listen to those voices, and we have to take some proactive steps to say, what can we do in our programs to have student groups who feel like they're not being sort of responded to, that we can do something better to address their concerns and needs. I think we also have to encourage some real courageous conversations with our staff who are not connecting with staff and students of color. I would imagine that many of our students, many of our programs across the board, if we look at our evaluations, some of our colleagues, though we might be well-intended, are not quite making the mark with connecting with students around issues tied to race and racial injustice and racial equity. We can't leave those folks alone on islands. We can't act as if we don't know who those folks are. We have to be willing to engage in some serious conversations to say, how can we put plans of action in place to support those individual individual faculty members, because the students will tell us who they are. Our students tell us that these folks are not providing them with the skills that they need to be able to handle these conversations or how to support racially diverse students. So we have to do a better job in-house having courageous conversations about what we're doing to support those individuals who are not able to, or perhaps not willing to support our students of color. And I maintain that part of what we have to do is we have to stress to ourselves, we have to stress to our colleagues, and I maintain we have to stress to many of our students that we have to start getting comfortable being uncomfortable. Issues and conversations and discussions and taking real proactive steps around racial equity, these are typically hard processes. They do not happen overnight. It causes people to feel very uncomfortable. It causes people to feel very uneasy at times. It can lead to some very heated conversations. It can lead to very intense exchanges. But I think that is the work of being anti-racist, is that we are not running away from, we are not shying away from these real hard conversations we must have around all of our processes. Who we admit, how we support, what we teach, what our curriculum looks like, what our placements are like, what kind of support are our candidates getting in the field. Sometimes the ways in which those conversations don't take place are more damaging than the ones that do take place. And so therefore we've got to be in the space of being uncomfortable, being comfortable, being uncomfortable. And we have to be willing to call out, and I think we need to say this, call out challenges and ideas and acts of anti-Black racism. I think if we talk about anti-racist education, I think that's a powerful place to start this work and to start our actions and to start our movement. But I think we also have to drill down, because in many cases across the state, across the country, we continue to hear acts of anti-Black racism where our Black students are oftentimes treated differently, talked to differently, connected with differently in ways that do not support them. And let me be clear, anti-Black racism is not only the kind of racism that affects Black people, but I want to also stress, and we need to stress this to our teacher candidates, that anti-Black racism also happens within other communities of color. So in Latinx communities, there is anti-Black racism. Within Asian American communities, there's anti-Black racism. Oftentimes, we don't recognize that shadeism is real, and the ways in which we begin to sort of position and see those of darker hues as being more sort of troublesome, less capable, less intellectually able, I think is a real problem in many and in all communities of color. So therefore, we're having to engage, I think, our students at the university level about definitions of anti-Black racism, examples of anti-Black racism, and steps we take to dismantle anti-Black racism, because it plays itself out in more ways than we're oftentimes willing to acknowledge, okay? So to that end, what do we have to be prepared for as we have these conversations? You all are probably familiar with Robin DiAngelo's work on white fragility, because as we attempt to have these conversations with our colleagues, you are going to find yourself in different ways probably encountering resistance. You're going to find yourself in situations where people will push back. There are many of our colleagues, and let me be clear about this, some white, some folks of color, who don't want to get into conversations about race, around anti-racism, around anti-Black racism. And oftentimes what Robin DiAngelo says is this white fragility sort of manifests itself in folks who take on these defensive moves. They oftentimes attempt to deflect. They will oftentimes shut down. They will oftentimes try to move the conversation in another sort of on another topic, with the idea being that talking about race is just hard. Talking about race is uncomfortable. Talking about race just makes me feel guilty. Talking about race is something we shouldn't be doing. Shouldn't we have a colorblind approach? I maintain that we might even think about using works such as DiAngelo's in our courses so that our candidates can get comfortable with understanding the ways in which white fragility manifests itself, because there's a very high likelihood that they may go into schools where they see examples of white fragility playing out. So the point here is understanding that defensiveness, hostility, fear are oftentimes a byproduct of having these conversations. I think when these conversations come up and there are attempts to somehow divert them, per Robin DiAngelo's point, she says, stay the course, stay the course, stay the course. For us, here's the point that I frequently make. If our colleagues are uncomfortable, if our colleagues are uneasy sitting in a faculty meeting, talking about race for an hour or two, if they're uncomfortable just in having that conversation, then they need to think about how is it that some of our students of color who are in K-12 classrooms who feel uncomfortable every single day because of the kinds of racial hostilities that they are oftentimes confronted with. So if our being uncomfortable creates a set of conditions and circumstances that leads to us doing this work differently so that fewer students out in K-12 schools have to experience this discomfort, I think that's well worth the price. So understand there's going to be resistance as we do this work. I also think we have to think about anti-racism curriculum in classrooms. And when we do that, we have to think about this in a multi-pronged approach. Someone who I've learned a lot from in this regard, and I'll give her major props, Darlene Lee. my colleague. I so appreciate you, the things I've seen you do, the things I've heard you do, the examples you have done around our ethnic studies work at UCLA, I think is a prime example of what an anti-racism approach is. So part of what we think about this is how do we think about making sure that the content that our candidates are going to have access to celebrates people of color, and that we begin to engage in work that challenges whiteness. Again, I know I'm kind of biased here. I'm shouting out all my UCLA folks. Jeff Shear has done amazing work around critical media literacy to ensure that we make sure that our students have the abilities to critique and challenge the content that they're coming across. Part of what I love and what I've always admired about our teacher ed students is that they are not of the faint of heart. They will challenge, they will push back, they will say, why are we centering the voices of white history, white people, white culture, white experiences in ways that doesn't talk about the experiences of folk of color, of queer folk, of folks who have historically been marginalized. So I think we have to challenge whiteness in our curriculum. We have to challenge whiteness in our content. We have to challenge whiteness in some of the ways in which we do this work. I think also an anti-racist classroom also does not punish differences. And you all know this. Our state has not done a good job in terms of how we continue to disproportionately suspend and exclude Black children in this state. And I think that means that frequently we see difference as defiant, we see difference as deviant, we see difference as deficit. And so we've got to do a better job helping our students recognize the ways in which cultural manifestations play themselves out so that kids are not being punished and harmed for being their authentic selves. So therefore, we have to talk about the way that the anti-racist classroom does not punish students for being their authentic selves. Therefore, we have to seek more restorative approaches. I think the anti-racism classroom is again linked to this ideal that we are not trying to push out, we are not trying to exclude, we're not trying to harm. We want to find ways to help students redeem themselves when they have perhaps caused harm within our communities. We want to help them to understand that part of what students do, and we know this from the research on mental health, that hurt people hurt people. And for students who are oftentimes suffering from issues around trauma or adverse experiences, the ways in which that behavior plays itself out should not result in further punitive action, but should result in some kind of collective action to somehow find ways to restore and rebuild and re-engage those students within our classroom. So we have to begin to talk to our students about what that looks like, show them good models, have that demonstrated so they can begin to use these practices within the context of their own respective classrooms. And I would say in this moment, I think that what happens in an anti-racist classroom, there's an honoring of Black Lives Matter. And this has been one of the topics I found fascinating over the past couple of months, because there are folks in our field who don't want to say Black Lives Matter, who don't believe that Black Lives Matter, and think that any suggestion of even iterating Black Lives Matter is somehow an attempt to say that other lives do not matter. And to that, what I would say is that if you look at the way in which the Black Lives Matter movement has unfolded, Black Lives Matter does not mean only Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter does not mean that Black Lives Matter more. Black Lives Matter does not suggest that we are somehow saying that this is a zero-sum game, that if you help Black students, that you're taking away from other students. And of course, we know all lives matter, but at the end of the day, I don't think we can say all lives matter until Black Lives Matter. So I think if we're talking about what an anti-racist curriculum and classroom would look like, it would take these factors into consideration to ensure that we're having ongoing discussions and conversations. I was moved, probably like many of you, during the protests that happened the last few months at the multi-ethnic, multiracial makeup of the protesters. I was also really sort of intrigued by the multi-age makeup of the protesters. Many of those young people were school-age young people. We can rest assured they're probably going to come back to their classrooms virtually ready to engage in these very topics. So we should be mindful of that. So that's why it's important for us to think about cognitive science. I think that what's critical to this work is that we can do this work when we are tied to relationships. I will stress that. I think we need to do a better job of helping our students understand the role that relationships play in building bridges, of sort of understanding some of the racial realities of our students. And there's an ongoing body of literature in the field of cognitive scientists a science that tells us that relationships influence neuroplasticity, which connects the brain's ability to connect, learn, comprehend, process, analyze, memorize. When students do not feel connected, they are far less likely to do well in schools. And what we know is that when you look at the students who are least connected in our schools, there's a clear set of racial ramifications associated with that. So we have to understand that. So to that end, I've been really sort of advocating for this little book right here. I was fortunate enough to work with a couple of classroom teachers where we talk about what actual relationship building looks like in classrooms, examples, how relationships can occur across racial, ethnic, gender identity expression, social identities, that it really requires us taking time out to step back to understand who our students are, learn about our students, ask about their interests, probe their own aspirations, share of ourselves, but we can find ways to do that better. And here are some other works that I'm big fan of. If we're looking for ways to engage this work, Zaretta Hammond's book on culture responsive teaching the brain, Eduardo Bonilla Silva's work on racism without racism. Many of you all use these works. And I want to say this, I want to also make sure that we are talking explicitly and persistently about racial microaggressions, because that is one of the ways in which these issues play themselves out in our classrooms. You all know this, but we need to continue expressing to our candidates that racial microaggressions are not oftentimes intentional. These are hostile, derogatory, negative slights that essentially sort of, I refer to them as like death by 1,000 paper cuts. They are oftentimes situated in such a manner where the perpetrators are usually unaware that they have said or that they have done something that conveys a sense of hostility or exclusion or invisibility towards certain people. So when they happen, the victim has to figure out in the moment, how do I respond? Do I respond? If I respond in a particular way, then I am seen as the angry, fill in the blank. And so oftentimes the person who engages it doesn't even know that they've said it. So we have to call this on the carpet when it happens. You all know, and I think it's important if we're going to create anti-racist curriculum in teacher education, that these microaggressions cut across all social identities. So it's not only racial. Microaggressions can be gendered. They can be tied to gender identity and expression. They can be tied to socioeconomic status. They can be tied to a host of other social identities, and we have to call them on the carpet. And part of what we also want to stress is that we have to remember that intention does not always equal impact. So just because individuals might say that they intend to be harmful or hurtful doesn't mean that the impact has still not been real. So let's make sure we're having those conversations around racial microaggressions and microaggressions in general that are happening, so that our students don't feel marginalized and silenced in our university classrooms or in the K-12 spaces. And I'm giving a brief little plug. My colleague, Danny Solorzano, and his colleague and former student, Lindsay Uber Perez, are coming out with a book that is going to be amazing around how we identify racial microaggressions and how we dismantle those racial microaggressions. And that book should be out in the fall. I wish I could recall the name of that book, but you'll see it because it will definitely be something that we all can benefit from. And I think these microaggressions have to be called out in some of our faculty meetings, because many of us who are right on this Zoom call right now, we've sat in meetings and we've heard the folks who we work with who have engaged in microaggressions, who have said things, who have made comments, who have made innuendos that we know are highly inappropriate and are highly unacceptable. And sometimes we hear those comments and we all look around looking to see if anybody's going to be the person who says something. And sometimes there's silence. And many of you on this call, many of you on this Zoom call have been the ones who have spoken up, and you speak out often about these microaggressions, but then you've endured the label, or you've been labeled as the person who is the troublemaker because you speak out when these issues occur. My thing is, keep speaking out, embrace the label. I'm thinking about, we just recently lost Congressman John Lewis. He talked about getting into trouble, or he called it good trouble, necessary trouble. Many of you have gotten into good trouble, necessary trouble, by challenging your colleagues, by challenging them to be better. And I think this is the kind of spirit that we want to prepare our teacher candidates with, so they can get involved in good trouble, necessary trouble. So let's hear, I want to sort of take the last few minutes to talk about ways that we can rethink racial equity in teacher education. And many of you are already involved in taking these steps, but I just want to reinforce them. I want to sort of stress them again because I think that they need to be part of our constant thinking and framing. I think we have to start thinking about, number one, our admissions policies. We spend a lot of time thinking about what are the set of requirements that we think individuals need to have to be in our programs. Some of the requirements are really beyond our scope because they are university requirements, but some of those I think need to be rethought and reconsidered. I have been one who's always questioned if certain GPA minimums should be in place because I think sometimes the GPA requirements are the very obstacles that have kept out perhaps some of our best and brightest teacher candidates. And so I think we need to think about our admissions policies to make sure that we're not engaging in the exclusion of some of these very antiquated policies that we use around how we admit students. I also think we need to start thinking about how we evaluate the racial composition of our faculty and our field support. We know that issues around teacher diversity have been an issue for a very long time. However, that doesn't mean that we don't still keep thinking, talking, and doing some things to figure out how we can create a much more racially inclusive makeup of faculty and field support. We want to see to it as best as we can that the folks who are part of our respective teams, the folks who are part of the respective works that we do, in some way, shape, or form are coming close to resembling the communities that we serve, and so that our students are able to engage with a diverse group of teacher educators. So we have to keep thinking and talking about that. I would also ask us to begin to think, what is the racial makeup of the schools that we partner with and the mentor teachers that we pair our candidates with? Again, we need to be very sensitive to the fact that in some cases, we are preparing our teacher candidates for school environments that are very different from the ones that they may have grown up in, are very different than the kinds of schools that they have attended. So the more we can think about placements in race diverse settings, and for some of us, I mean, that's all we do is put our teacher candidates in diverse placements because that's the makeup of the cities that we do this work. But we also want to ask, who are we asking to be our mentor teachers? There's been a growing body of research that tells us that in many cases that faculty, teachers of color are able to do a much more impactful job in formulating sustained relationship with students of color compared to many of their white colleagues. Our teacher candidates need to be in those classrooms to see what those teachers of color do and how they formulate those relationships and how they build those connections. But at the same time, I want to be clear because we also know many white teachers are also able to formulate those kinds of connections. And we need to have our teacher candidates in those classrooms so that they can learn how is it that white teachers are able to bridge those racial divides and bridge those cultural divides so that they can connect. I just think that I know this is a difficult thing. We talk about this a lot because frequently the really good mentor teachers are being pulled in 100 different directions. We're oftentimes competing with neighboring institutions to get our candidates in those classrooms of the amazing mentor teachers. Sometimes we're doing all that we can to try to rush to ask if these amazing guiding teachers and mentor teachers will be willing to take on our students. But we have to think about how we can not overwork and burden those teachers to the point where they no longer want to mentor. So we have to begin to think about our pool so that we don't sort of burn out the ones who are really good at what they do. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have to begin to think about our curriculum and ask, what does our curriculum look like? Does it have an explicit focus on anti-racism? Does it address issues around sort of the racial realities of our students of color? Does it talk about the history of communities of color where we are doing this work? Does it engage in conversations around gentrification that we're seeing happening in lots of cities across the state? Does it begin to talk about the ways in which we see, in this moment at least, essential workers, many of whom are people of color, how their health and safety is being really endangered in these times? So part of what we have to begin to take a look at is what are our students being exposed to in terms of their reading? What are the assignments that we're requiring them to do? Is it really sort of thoughtful, deep-seated, applicable work? Or is it only just the high theory that doesn't give them a sense of how they can connect the theory and the research to practice? So here are some steps that I'm sure you all are already talking about and thinking about in your respective teacher education programs, but we have to double down, we have to triple down to make sure that these issues around racial equity remain a core part, not a tangential part, but a core part of the work we do. And as many of you know, you've already gotten that label as the troublemaker. go ahead and embrace that troublemaker label, because if you raise these issues up, you are going to be doing the work that's going to adequately prepare your students for the work and for the kinds of experiences that they're going to have in the field when they go there. So I always ask too of my students in teacher education, what is your why? And I think in this moment, your why means more than perhaps it's ever meant before, because lives are literally hanging in the balance. What your why is going to shape the ways in which we sort of present ourselves as teacher educators in this moment. The ways in which we are talking about the health, safety, well-being, mental health wise, and psychological safety of our students and the students that they serve should be part of our why. So I think we have to really, really think long and hard about how we take some different steps, some alternative approaches to how we center, how we anchor issues of racism, but also be mindful of this, that much of the real critical race work also looks at intersections and also unpacks the ways in which we know other systems of oppression, such as patriarchy and transphobia and homophobia, also have a clear set of racial ramifications that also must be a part of our work and has to be integral to our curriculum and has to be part of our conversation, because our students are seeing this, they're living this, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't engage them in a way that is tied to those realities as well. So I'm going to stop right there and say thank you, thank you, thank you. I want to see if we can engage in some Q&A, because I know I've got a lot of really smart people here who are part of this conversation. So I'd love to see if we can take our remaining time to engage in some more discussion around how we do this work and how we engage teacher education in this moment for what our students are going to need. So I'll stop right there.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Any questions, people? If you want to post them in the chat or raise your hand, go ahead and chime in if you have a question or comment.
So I have a question. Thank you very much, Dr. Howard, for your comments. Very illuminating. So I have a question. One of the things that when I think about the movement, right, is we have to think about what are we going to invest in, and at the same time, what are we going to disinvest in, right? And so it's kind of runs parallel. And one of the things that kind of struck me, and I think that many programs deal with, is who we let in the program. And then because once we let someone in the program that doesn't have like the training, or that doesn't have hasn't taken these anti-racist or ethnic studies courses in the past, and it's the first time that they're seeing some of these things in our program, some of the things that happens is that they tend to be the microaggressors, right? And I hate to use this kind of Bush terminology, but the collateral damage that happens by accepting one person, you really hurt about 4 or 5 or 10 people that person hurts. So one of the questions that I keep asking is, how can we do a better job to, in the interview process, to ask questions that gets at people's ideologies, right? Or that kind of, gets at some deficit thinking right off the bat, so that we are aware of, we can be better prepared to say, this person can cause trouble, right? And when we're talking about issues of racism and such. Do you have any ideas about that, or can expand on that?
I think that's an excellent question. I appreciate that, Doc. That's a very good question. And I know over the years, having been involved in some of our admissions work with teacher education, we know this, that the individuals who apply for our programs are really smart. And so in some cases, they learn the buzzwords and they learn the appropriate things to say. And they know how to somehow touch upon the key words of the day that can make them sound as if they really get it. And then they get into our programs and we're thinking, how did this person get in with these sets of ideas and beliefs when we thought we screened folks, right? And I'm not saying that we want to have people who all have a certain mind. We want some diversity and thought. I want to be clear there. But there is some real destructive deficit thinking that folks bring to this work. And so to your question, I think we've got to be a lot more willing to deliberate around any red flags that come up for us during these interviews. I think for us, and Emma's here, Emma's been great in this regard. We've talked about, sort of the value of interviews and just seeing people in person, seeing how they interact with other candidates and how they discuss these issues. And I'm always a little leery of folks who either do one of two things. The folks who talk too much in those interview sessions, sometimes that's a red flag. Like, okay, you're in a group session, it's a fishbowl activity, you're doing a whole lot of the talking. Or the folks who don't talk at all. I'm thinking, what are you not wanting to say? Are you not agreeing with? And part of the reality is that there are a lot of folks, let's be frank for a second here, who are entering into this profession because they have a savior mentality. They see it as their responsibility to save poor kids, save Black and brown kids because they are not enlightened or educated. I think we have to think about giving students some really, really hard, thought-provoking sort of dilemmas to read and to discuss in our presence, to name anti-racism in some of these prompts that they have and ask how they would respond, to talk about issues around exploitation of working class. I think we have to just take hard topics and put them on the table and see how folks grapple with that, either in their writing or in their responses. I think we cannot just have these real surface level kinds of conversations. Do you love children? Do you love diverse communities? Because I mean, that folks have learned how to kind of give those simple answers. I think we have to ask hard questions. We have to even create some situations where we probe them further to elaborate on their responses. And if we start to hear some thinking that is highly, problematic, that should be a sign, because you're right. We get some folks in our program. I know everyone here has had these students who inflict lots of harm because of the kinds of microaggressions that we're talking about, where you're trying to build community, you're trying to move forward, and folks are saying and doing some really destructive things in our space. So I just think we have to be much more stringent on the front end so we can have fewer headaches down the line.
Thank you.
Dr. Howard, I like to this is Evelyn Young from UCI. I like to piggyback on, is it Dr. Cordero's comment? UCI, as you can well imagine, is a completely different setting. We have a lot of white conservative schools where we send our teacher candidates, and the conversations that we have is difficult, as you can well imagine. And we have maybe a few courses on culture, diversity, and equity. And we have, obviously our candidates, many of them come from a local area, and it is almost impossible to screen and filter out all the candidates who want to become teachers, who want to do good work, and yet they come with these ideologies that are so difficult to change in a 14-month program. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, I almost feel like, as much as I would love to work at UCLA, where there's a strong Center X anti-racist curriculum and foundation, there's so much work on our end that will that is necessary to humanize pedagogy, to deconstruct this idea of we can't work together. Like Paulo Freire is very big on, it's not just about the oppressed, it's also about the oppressors working together in order to form this praxis of reflection and action to promote change. And from my end, it's almost about, let's get these troublemakers and talk to them, and how do I shift their thinking? But I know that in 14 months there, I also know that there's going to be a lifelong journey for them to grow, but all I can do is plant the seed. But I also know that what they learn in the classroom is not going to translate into their field work, because in their field work, they are in predominantly wealthy areas. So I am having a lot of trouble trying to figure out, how do I get the message across so that they can actually practice it, so that they can see that what we're talking about is just not theory, but it's also, it's humanizing work. How do I get them there?
Yeah, how much time we have for this question? Because Evelyn, so just to give some context, that's my alma mater. I went to UCI as an undergrad, so I know that community well. I know that context well. And yeah, you are spot on in terms of the very conservative nature, though it's changing, I've been hearing, though it's slightly changing, at least in northern parts of Orange County. Now, southern Orange County is a whole different ball game. But you're right. You said something that I think is so important, that our job, our responsibility, realistically speaking, is to plant seeds. Because when you take, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25-year-old folks who have had a very set way of thinking about life, who have a set way of thinking about communities, the thought that we can change that in 14 months, I love the ambitiousness of it, but it's probably not very realistic. But we can only try to plant seeds and try to help give them examples, because I think for many of those candidates and many of those students you're referring to, I don't think some of them, and this is hard for me to say, but I mean, if I'm wrong, please push back on this. Many of them don't know what they have never seen Black and brown children who are highly successful in the classroom. So they don't fundamentally believe that brown children can succeed. They don't fundamentally believe that language learners are highly intellectually gifted. They don't believe that children who come from sort of different family dynamics are just as successful as other students are. So we have to try to help them see what success looks like. We have to help them see what engagement and what, the kinds of amazing intellectual ability and capacity that we know children in Santa Ana and Tustin and all these areas that have. But I think what we have to begin to push upon is doing this work solely in places like Irvine or Rancho Santa Margarita, or these places that are just, not as diverse. But I want to be clear, but because we need to have teachers there who are pushing the envelope. So you've got a huge task. And I would imagine that your task is not just the community in which you do this work. I don't know that sometimes the task is within. And I don't know what the makeup of your colleagues are like, because sometimes you may face more fights inside of your department, and I don't want to start any trouble here, than you face with the folks on the outside. And so if you basically can find ways to sort of work collaboratively with folks who share your vision to create more anti-racist approaches to how they do this work, start there. Find folks who are out in the field that you can work with as mentor or guiding teachers who can be the examples of what you want students to have access to. It's a process, but yes, you have a huge task. And I think you have to chip and chip and chip and chip away, because you're right. These are decades old mentalities that we're trying to transform. These are ideologies that have been set in stone for a long time. And it's not going to happen overnight. So I just say kudos to you for being there. Thank you for doing that work, because it's desperately needed there.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? We're almost out of time. We're going to go break out into small groups to discuss further, but any final comments or questions? And Dr. Howard, I don't know if you are checking the chat, but there's some good comments there for you.
There are some very good comments here about testing. Don't get me started on testing. That's a big, big obstacle, right?
Yeah.
I like Steve's comment about screening out the undesirables. I'll leave that one alone, but I know exactly what he means by that. This is really, really rich conversation. And I think our work is getting more challenging because we are seeing, so here's our challenge. I don't know what others are seeing, but I know in some programs across the state, we're seeing a decrease in the number of folks who are even pursuing the profession, which means that the pool we have to choose from is getting smaller. And as that pool gets smaller, for us to meet certain numbers, we oftentimes have to lower the threshold of who we would admit, which is a good thing to do, because that speaks to some of the very challenges I hear folks speaking to in the chat here about how we can still hold standards even as we have to go a little deeper into the very groups of students who we may not want to be in our programs. But I think we have to talk about it with our colleagues, talk about it with our teaching partners, and begin to think about how we can sort of do this collaboratively. I see Susan asked a question. What was the title of the book that I showed at the end of the presentation? Which one was that? I forgot that quick.
Is it possible for us to get a copy of?
Yes. Can I send that to you, Lisa? Can I send you the
yes,
PowerPoint?
please. Yes,
Okay.
and I will post it for everybody to have access.
Perfect.
So.
Perfect.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I know we all really learned a lot, and that was such an inspiring and valuable hour of our time.